What's up everybody? I hope you're all doing well wherever you are and whatever you're up to. In fact, on that subject, do let me know what you're up to, because I'm interested to see how you're all spending your time in this very difficult period. Lots of you have been messaging me already to let me know that you're learning new things or taking on new challenges. So, share those with me. It might help to motivate you to finally achieve them at some point, because you can keep checking in on each other a little bit like I've done with you with my impromptu piano lessons. Anyway, today's video, as I'm out on my one allowable walk per day, as we now are from today onwards in the UK, I thought you guys could come along with me. You can get some virtual exercise, if that's a thing. Two questions I want answering today, or I'm going to try and answer. In fact, three really. One is, were Mercedes using a version of their DAS system back in 2018? There's a video doing the rounds online that you may well have seen. So we are going to take a closer look at that and confirm or deny whether that was indeed the case. The other one is looking at McLaren's decision to stick with the switch to Mercedes engines for 2021, even though we're not switching to the 2021 cars, which is what it was always planned for. Interesting decision. Going to provide a number of challenges, so we're going to get into that as well. And the third and final question that I kind of need your help in answering, during this difficult period where we can't go out anymore, we're all kind of locked down into our homes, at what point does it become acceptable to let your wife cut your hair? I mean, I need help with that. Do we all just end up with long hair, or is it okay to let a member of your family loose with a pair of scissors? Who knows? Right, let's look at this video then, because many of you sent me this over the past week, which I really appreciate, by the way. Thank you very much to all those who did. If you take a look at it now, this green line, if you look closely at the green line and its relationship to the top of the steering wheel, it really does look, doesn't it, like the steering wheel moves back as Lewis comes onto the straight, much like we now know the DAS system works to adjust the toe angle of the front wheels. So is that what's happening? Well, I've taken an even closer look at this, and the thing that I think you need to re-look at now, if I play it again, is the relationship now between the top of the chassis, so the chassis opening, the silver part, the top of the car, and the top of the screen. And just look how that moves in relation to each other as well. I think it's partly due to water on the camera lens distorting the image, but much more so than that, the camera pod on top of the car flexing at speed. Because if the camera pod flexes, of course, the entire image moves. And a line that's drawn on the screen, which doesn't move in relation to the camera pod, would look like the steering wheel's moving. What I think is actually happening is the entire image is shifting by a few millimeters, making that look like that's the case. Have a look at it yourself, see if you agree, but I don't think that DAS was being used back in Hungary in 2018, as this video perhaps suggests. Hopefully, we've put that one to bed. By the way, I fully appreciate how lucky I am to live in such a beautiful spot. At times like this, where we are so restricted in where we can go, I've got all this on my doorstep. I will never not appreciate that, believe me. Nor will these guys. When I first heard McLaren's decision to go ahead with the switch to Mercedes power units for 2021, despite the fact that we're not going ahead with the switch to 2021 cars, I'll admit I was a little surprised. First of all, you could imagine that it could end up being a pretty awkward conversation if McLaren did want to stick with Renault for an extra year. It's a bit like, telling your boyfriend or girlfriend of many years that you want to split up and you're going to move out, only to go back a couple of days later and say that the person you've now met isn't ready for you to move in, so could you hang on for an extra couple of weeks? And the other potential scenario that shouldn't be ignored in this, one that I hope isn't true, is that perhaps Renault are planning on pulling out of Formula One at the end of 2020. And maybe McLaren already know that. And therefore maybe there is no such thing as a Renault engine supply for next year. Who knows? What McLaren do get, and this is a big positive, is a great power unit from Mercedes. The class leader. This is the most successful power unit in the entire hybrid era by miles. That's got to be a huge plus for a team that is desperately looking to find its way back inside the top three in Formula One. and on a trajectory that currently means that if they keep putting pieces like this together, they may well just get back there. It also gives them a year of working with Mercedes before this massive change that Formula One introduces, which is now coming for 2022. That's also a big plus, because the introduction of these new regulations was going to be a huge enough challenge for everybody involved, let alone having to work with a new engine partner at the same time and in the build up to that. So having a year to integrate your two organisations together, to start working, building that working relationship, start understanding what each team requires from the other to get the best out of each other, that's also a huge plus. But these things definitely do not come without their challenges. But hey, we're all facing challenges right now, aren't we? I mean, this is us trying to work from home and become parents during homeschooling. One of my biggest challenges is the fact that my wife's on conference calls all day long, yet refuses to wear headphones. So I'm having to listen to her entire office talk to each other very loudly that reverberates around the house. There's a challenge. What about McLaren though? Look, McLaren's challenges are probably centred more around the fact that we've got this unique situation where the 2020 cars that are yet to race, at the moment, everyone hopes and expects that those cars will just shift into 2021, and that's where we'll get our championship from. They're still working out the exact rules of how we freeze that technology, how we prevent teams from spending a huge amount of money to continue development and essentially turning up for 2021 with brand new cars. But if you're McLaren and you're having to switch from an engine that's currently being provided by Renault to one that's been provided by Mercedes, well, there are some serious challenges in that in itself. You know, one of the main things being that the engine, the power unit, or the engine itself, the internal combustion engine, is actually it's a stressed member on a Formula One car. It bolts hard up against the back of the chassis. It takes all the torsional load. It's part of the car. The gearbox bolts directly to the back of the engine, and all the torsional loads, the suspension loads, the twisting forces running through the car are transmitted through the engine block itself. So it's a structural integral member component within that car. Because it bolts hard up against the back of the chassis, unlike your road car where there's plenty of space around the edge of the engine bay for little bits to stick out and little components to sit and a bit of space to get your hand in to do some work, that's not the case on a Formula One car. The back of the chassis is mated perfectly to the front of the engine, and quite often what will happen is that your oil tank will be mounted on the front of the engine, and there'll be a corresponding recess in the back of your chassis to accommodate that. The mechanical fuel pump that sits inside the chassis will have its drive taken directly off the front of the engine. So those two components on the engine and on the chassis have to be perfectly aligned, and I'm talking perfectly aligned. Other things like oil lines, fuel lines, pipework, bits of nuts and bolts that are on the back of or front of the engine, those little recesses to accommodate those little components have to be perfectly aligned on the back of the chassis as well. So the two have to be designed together. The pickup points on the back of the chassis, the studs that the engine slides onto, well, they are in a standard position. So we don't need to modify the position of those, but it's everything around that absolutely will need some attention. So if the regulations are frozen and you can't modify your chassis, what do McLaren do? I think the truth is that discussions are happening right now to give some dispensation to allow some modifications for this to happen. But there'll have to be some very strict requirements in those allowances to make sure that no performance benefits from redesigning your chassis in terms of aero or structural integrity or those kind of things could give McLaren an unfair advantage that other teams are unable to compete with. So that's one thing that's quite a tricky thing to work out. The other thing that has to happen, of course, is the installation of that power unit from Mercedes is very different to that of the Renault. I mean, for example, at the moment, McLaren with their Renault power unit currently have one of their coolers, at least one of their coolers, up above the top of the engine, behind the air intake, behind the driver's head. Whereas Mercedes don't have that currently, they have theirs tucked down in the side pods, and that completely alters the shape of the side pod and the Coke bottle, the rear end of the car. On a Mercedes, it looks, you can see it very clearly, it looks very different to that of a McLaren. And that, of course, completely changes the aero profile of the car. So when McLaren had designed their chassis for this year, with the aero profile and the aero map that it generates, that it was constructed around, that was all to accommodate this Renault power unit that they currently have. To now modify that to accommodate a Mercedes power unit, yes, it's definitely doable, but it could end up being a compromise. Either they compromise in terms of the way they install that Mercedes power unit, and perhaps they have to compromise and fit the Mercedes power unit into something that was originally more or less centered around the Renault unit, or they have to compromise their aero package because it will no longer seamlessly link away to the way that the chassis was designed to accommodate the optimum engine package or power unit installation from Mercedes. Either way, it feels like it might be something of a compromise. But as I said at the beginning, there's loads of challenges going on right now. We're all struggling with different challenges all over the world, and in the grand scheme of things, the challenge that Mercedes and McLaren will have come the end of 2020, preparing for 2021, well, it doesn't really matter, does it? It's not that significant. And the benefits that I talked about earlier, in my opinion, will significantly outweigh whatever compromises they have to make in terms of them being ready for a full-on assault on potentially the title. Why not in 2022 when the new regs come in? Anyway, food for thought, isn't it? It's going to be interesting to see how those discussions behind the scenes go, because all of the teams are going to have to agree to allow McLaren to make whatever changes they have to make. And that, as we all know, is not an easy time, but it feels like not just in Formula One, but the entire world, we're all being a little bit more forgiving to each other. We're all being a little bit more understanding, isn't it, right now? These changes, these challenges, these unprecedented times, hopefully, I mean, maybe, keep your fingers crossed, maybe we'll come out of this all being a little bit more, I don't know, maybe we can all live together a little bit easier with each other. And perhaps Formula One might just fall into line with that as well. Who knows? Anyway, thanks very much for watching, guys. I'd love it if you give a thumbs up and a like to the video. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, please do. Hit subscribe and hit that little notification bell down in the corner, and then you will not miss another one, because I do this all the time. In fact, right now, I'm literally doing it all the time. So loads of content to come. I've got some really interesting stuff currently in the edit, which I'll be rolling out over the next week as well as all of the daily content where we talk about, well, whatever you guys want. So look, subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it, and I will see you again very soon. Stay safe, look after each other. Ta-ra.